Do Stalin's strengths or his opponent's weaknesses better explain his victory in the struggle for power after Lenin's death? I'll start with a little context, an outline of the key events between the Bolshevik seizure of power in November 1917 and Lenin's death in January 1924. I'll then say something about how historians have disagreed about why Stalin won the power struggle, and look at some of the key approaches to the question. In particular, the importance of Stalin's position as General Secretary of the party, the policy debates of the 1920s, and the Soviet political culture. So we'll start with a little context. The Bolsheviks, a group of 20,000 or so committed revolutionaries, led a coup d'etat in St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire, on November 7, 1917. Taking power in the capital was the easy bit. After that, they had to take power in the rest of the world's largest country. And they had to do that while fighting a war against Russian and foreign armed forces determined to stop them. They succeeded in the course of the following 2.5 years, but not without very real costs. Infrastructure was devastated, and the economy was running at about 5% of capacity. The working class was upset with the regime. The army was beginning to mutiny, and the peasantry were on the verge of rebellion. In order to ensure the survival of the new state and to reinvigorate the economy, Bolshevik leaders accepted the need for a partial restoration of capitalism. The new economic policy, or NEP, as this shift was known, quickly generated substantial economic growth, such that what had begun as a retreat was gathering supporters. The story of the power struggle and of Stalin's rise begins when the universally acknowledged leader of the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin, who had spoken out both for and against NEP, died, as I said, in January 1924. The struggle took place against a background of debate over policy, over NEP, and over the future of communism. So why did Stalin succeed Lenin, and not Trotsky or Zinoviev or Bukharin? So I'll talk a bit now about historians on Stalin's rise, and particularly on their thoughts on the role of ideas versus machine politics in Stalin's victory. So let me take a few minutes to discuss the different ways this question has been answered by historians since the events themselves. From the early 1930s, friends of the Stalin regime insisted that their leader won because he stuck most closely to Lenin's ideas, and because his opponents drifted away from Leninism towards counter-revolution. They insisted that policy debate and ideas were the key to the struggle. The losers in the struggle insisted that ideas didn't matter because Stalin was party general secretary. The general secretary had the power to appoint all top party officials. Ideas didn't matter because Stalin had stacked the party with officials personally loyal to him, people who would support him regardless of the policy options. They insisted that Stalin's control of the party machine was what mattered in the struggle. Whereas Henri Barbusse represents the first group, Leon Trotsky perhaps best represents the second. That is, whereas Henri Barbusse represents the friends of Stalin, Leon Trotsky, his opponents. So from the 1930s until the late 1960s, the consensus among historians roughly aligned with Trotsky's view. That is, Stalin's control of the party machine played the decisive role in the power struggle. Among those historians putting forward this view are, for example, Isaac Deutscher, Merle Feinsod, Leonard Shapiro, or Robert Daniels. But in the late 1960s, when Cold War tensions were relaxing, the Soviet Union had reformed substantially since Khrushchev came to power. And the younger generation in the Western democracies was going through a period of rebellious idealism, such that the role of ideas in Soviet politics was once again taken more seriously. Stalin's control over the party machine still mattered to historians, but it was thought that the fact that Stalin appointed top officials didn't itself guarantee total loyalty. So to quote Robert Tucker in his book Stalin, A Political Biography, 1973, quote, "A would-be party chief had to develop a politically persuasive program and to be convincing in his way of presenting it in higher party circles," end quote. In the 1970s and 80s, social historians added a new twist to the story. They observed how social conditions, popular culture, and the culture of the Bolshevik Party favored Stalin's victory. Russian backwardness, low levels of literacy, and the weight of Russian autocratic tradition meant that most of Russians were tolerant of Stalin's heavy-handed ways. Meanwhile, the Bolshevik Party, which had grown from a 20,000-strong underground to a 1.2 million member super bureaucracy, was now much less educated on average and had a much weaker understanding of Marxism-Leninism. Stalin's simple formulations of Leninism appealed to them. His presentation of his opponents as splitters and party debate as a dangerous luxury hit a chord with the party rank and file. Since the 1980s, almost nothing has been written on this subject, such that the current consensus is that all these factors, policy debate and ideas, control of the political machine, political culture, all of these played a role in Stalin's rise to power. An answer to the question of whether Stalin's strengths or his opponent's weaknesses better explain Stalin's victory demands that all of them be given some consideration. So let's look at each in turn, starting with Stalin's role as General Secretary of the party. If the party General Secretary was such an important job, so important to the struggle for power, why did Stalin's opponents let him take it without any resistance? The short answer is because it was a job no one wanted. Stalin took over responsibility for the appointment of senior party officials at a time when the party bureaucracy was expanding faster than it had ever done or ever would. Appointing the right people to the right jobs was extremely important, and before Stalin took over, the Secretariat had not been coping with its task. It's worth observing here that Lenin offered the job of General Secretary to Stalin and no one else, because Stalin was the most able administrator in the party. Do not fall for Trotsky's characterization of Stalin as a mediocrity. He had been a member of Lenin's inner circle for years, and not for nothing. No one else wanted the job because they saw it as a dreadful bureaucratic burden. But did they not see that the job was an opportunity to promote friends and followers? You need to think about that. In the late 1940s, the historian Isaac Deutscher argued that Stalin, quote, packed political offices with friends, henchmen, and followers. In the 1950s and 1960s, Robert Daniels suggested a more subtle version of this, that there existed what he called a circular flow of power in which Stalin offered officials security of tenure if they supported him at major party meetings. But as I mentioned, by the 1970s and 80s, historians began to doubt that the fact of appointment by the Secretariat was enough to guarantee political loyalty. Recent research in the archives of the party's Secretariat has finally established that the idea that Stalin controlled the party apparatus by appointing his followers is largely a myth spread by Stalin's opponents. In fact, through the 1920s, the Secretariat was appointing thousands of officials every year. Stalin did not and could not know in detail, personally or politically, who was being appointed. What's more, there isn't a scrap of evidence that Stalin tried to use his role as General Secretary to remove those who sympathized with his opponents. But you should be careful here. I don't mean to suggest that the Secretariat played no role in his rise to power. Indeed, it played an important role, but one that didn't involve any control over party officialdom. The Secretariat provided Stalin not with control, but rather with information. In the course of its work, the Secretariat received a steady stream of reports from party institutions all over the country. Consequently, Stalin knew the preferences, wants, and fears of senior party officials better than any of his opponents. He was in a better position than his opponents to gain their support by catering to those wants and fears. You can see then that historians' views of the Secretariat have changed radically since the 1950s. In the 1950s, historians thought that Stalin controlled senior party officials. In the 1970s and 80s, historians had a hunch that Stalin could not rely on the loyalty of senior officialdom. And this has been confirmed by the recent research, but in a way that suggests a very different role for the Secretariat in Stalin's rise, one that makes the role of ideas and policy debate seem ever more important. So let's talk about that debate for a minute. In preparing for your A-levels, you should have a sense of the broad differences of opinion among the contenders for power, and who was in the Politburo majority when. But it becomes kind of tedious and unnecessary if you go into too much detail. So I'll keep my review very simple.